Zenaida Gould, and I'm the Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. Before we begin tonight's MACRI talk, I want to acknowledge the valiant struggles of the people of Ukraine who are fighting to preserve their sovereignty. Sovereignty, freedom, independence, these are values we hold dear in our democracy. Today, the primary election season started in the United States, with the primary election happening right now in Texas. All too often, we get complacent and don't exercise our right to vote. This is a right that was hard fought for by people like, as we'll hear tonight, Alonso Perales and many others. I hope that all of you tuning in from Texas have already cast your ballot, and that those of you from other states have your voting plan in place. Democracy is fragile and it needs your voice. Without further ado, tonight we are honored to welcome back Dr. Cynthia Orozco, preeminent scholar of Mexican American civil rights history. She's making her fourth appearance at a MACRI event, this time to discuss her latest book, a biography of Alonso S. Perales, this book, the principal founder of Lulac. He was a lawyer, a diplomat, a public intellectual, and a consummate advocate for the Mexican American community. Dr. Orozco is professor of history and humanities at Eastern New Mexico University, Ruidoso. She is the author of No Mexicans, Women, or Dogs Allowed, The Rise of the Mexican American Civil Rights Movement, as well as Agents of Change, Adela Slas-Vento, Mexican American civil rights activist and Texas feminist, as well as a prolific contributor to the Handbook of Texas Online, which is one of my favorite go-to resources for all things Texas history. And finally, before we get started, I want to thank tonight's event sponsor, AARP. Okay, Dr. Orozco, I would like to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Gould. I'm so happy to be with everybody here connected to the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. Before I begin, I'd like to say a little bit about myself. I am from Cuero, Texas, and I am the daughter of Mexican immigrants. I am a proud daughter of Aurora Estrada Orozco, who was an activist in Cuero, Texas, and a member of Lulac in the 1970s. I'm very familiar with San Antonio, having grown up with its news and its radio station. I'm going to talk tonight about Alonso S. Perales, one of the most significant Latinos in the United States, an elite man, but a self-made man, a man who lived from 1898 to 1960, one of the most articulate and powerful orators that we've ever had in our community, an effective and prolific writer, and one of the most important civil rights activists. And really, it would not be an understatement to call him the Latino Martin Luther King. My research began way back in 1978 when I was a sophomore at the University of Texas at Austin, taking my very first Chicano history class, never having any information about our heritage and culture before. Also, I was fortunate to have been a work study student at the University of Texas at Austin, Chicano Studies, where I was introduced to Dr. Arnoldo Vento, who had a mother, Adela Slas-Vento, who was a key activist from the 1920s up until the 1990s. At that time, Adela Slas-Vento introduced me through letter to Mrs. Perales, Marta Perales, the wife of Alonso S. Perales. Again, he had died in 1960. From that point on, I continued to study and write about the history and origins of the Lulac organization, and I wrote a senior honors thesis in 1980. Alonso Perales is mostly unknown to 99% of us. He was recognized truly by Adela Slas-Vento, who in her 70s wrote the first biography of him, a small book that did not reach many people. She was unable to travel. She was unable to get more people to recognize Alonso Perales. However, it's also true that in the 1950s, he was recognized by Spain in San Antonio and received a major merit award from Spain. By 1975, the newspaper called Chicano Times had an article asking who was Alonso Perales. Indeed, by that time, most people did not know that Alonso Perales had really initiated much of our Mexican American civil rights movement that really begins in the 1920s. Perales was a victim of institutional and racist neglect by archivists, by librarians, by historians, and we had so few historians of Mexican origin or anybody that was paying attention to Alonso Perales. Finally, his papers arrived at the University of Houston in 2009, and so for the very first time, the Perales archives were available to the public. Thereafter, there was a major conference, a book edited by Michael Olivas, attorney and scholar, and published by Arte Público Press. Perales was mostly attacked by Chicano historians. Before I began my work, they considered him to be anti-Mexican, petty bourgeois, and really underestimated his significance. Now, if we're going to talk about Alonso Perales, we do have to talk about Texas in general and San Antonio specifically. While he was born in Alice, Texas, much of his adult life was in San Antonio. San Antonio in the year 1900 had about 53,000 people only, but by 1930, largely due to the wave of Mexican immigrants coming in because of the Mexican Revolution, the population rose to 231,000 people, so that by 1930, 35% of the population was of Mexican descent, and that was about 80,000 persons of Mexican descent. By 1960, the percentage was up to about 41%. Likewise, in the 1920s, we began to see a significant small Mexican American middle class population, small business persons, artisans, etc. This was also a time with extensive violence, particularly the 1910s and the 1920s, with lynching, the KKK, 450,000 strong in Texas in 1920, and at least 500 in San Antonio. Between the 1890s and 1920s, we also had almost 300 lynchings of persons of Mexican descent. Likewise, we saw the rise of racial segregation, again due to this increasing Mexican immigrant population, with no Mexicans allowed signs in restaurants, hotels, schools, cemeteries, etc., all the way until the 1960s. And the educational situation was also bad. In 1942, in 122 school districts in 59 counties, we had the segregated Mexican schools. In 1920 in San Antonio, there were only 250 persons of Mexican descent in the high schools. So again, the situation was very poor. Also, there was a lack of political power. We know that in the 1900s and 1910s, we had only one Tejano state legislator, J.T. Canales, and not until 1956 did we get Henry B. Gonzalez, and then the first woman, Irma Rangel, in the 1970s. Not until 1960, in the 20th century, would we get Roy Barrera, Secretary of State, in the first statewide office that a person of Mexican descent would hold. San Antonio's politics were pretty pathetic. While there was no white primary in Bexar County, there was indeed the poll tax throughout Texas and the South, all the way from 1903 to 1965. And we began to see some civil rights activism and more political activity in the 20s and beyond. In the 1930s, we saw Perales work with an organization called the Association of Independent Voters. In the 40s, we saw him with the League of Loyal Americans and the Committee of 100. We also saw that after 1948, when Gus Garcia won the very first election as a school board member, Perales running several years before, the turnout slowly began to increase in our community, 55% in 1948, and by 1964, up to 87%. So we began to see greater and greater political power. Alonso Perales was actually born in Alice, Texas. It was a rural community, but was exceptionally rich culturally and educationally. Although his father, mother, and one sibling died, and making him an orphan, he was fortunate to be taken in by the Crescencio Trevino family. He was a barber, and he was influenced, we believe, by Eulalio Velasquez or Pablo Perez, both who were newspapermen and also who ran escuelitas in the community. Perhaps he was also influenced by Elena Zamora, who was a principal in Alice at the time. Because he was born into a working class family and then became an orphan, we also know that he struggled financially. He sold pan dulce and tamales. He also picked cotton and he worked on the railroad. Fortunately, he moved with some brothers to San Antonio, and he attended Drawn's Business College, where he learned white-collar skills, and he there worked at a calendar firm. He also worked at a saddlery company and also for the U.S. Postal Censorship Office during World War I. Also during World War I, he was drafted. He did not volunteer, but he improved his secretarial work. He'd never traveled outside of Texas during the war. However, after the war, he went on to Washington, D.C., to the Department of Commerce, and there he finished his high school degree and also went on to obtain a law degree at the National University School of Law, later connected with George Washington University, becoming the second or third Latino lawyer in Texas. Now, in San Antonio, around 1920, we began to see several Mexican-American civil rights organizations, the most important being the Order Sons of America. Perales returned to Texas in 1924 with his law degree, initiated a lecture tour along with J. Lou Symes talking about political empowerment. We know that the Order Sons of America had problematic leadership, particularly that of Santiago Tafoya Sr. The Order Sons of America was fractured. So finally in 1927, Perales helped to organize a convention in Harlingen where it was decided that a new organization would be founded, and that was the Latin American Citizens League, not to be confused with the Lulac organization, primarily in the Valley. The goal, however, since the Order Sons of America in 1920, was to create a statewide and national organization. In 1929, Lulac was founded, not with Perales as the first president, but it was Perales who orchestrated the selection of Ben Garza, who was really a compromise candidate, and it was J.T. Canales of Brownsville, the first Latino lawyer, that wrote the majority of the Constitution. Now, it is true that Paralyze was the key founder of Lulac. Without Paralyze, there would be no Lulac. There would have been fractured Order Sons of America. There were about 7 councils, but even in San Antonio, it did not stay united. It fractured into several other organizations. Paralyze was president of Lulac from 1930 to 1931. He also helped to found Council 16. Council 16 created a committee to improve the schools of San Antonio because they were underfunded. They were inferior buildings with not enough teachers, not enough books, etc. And that committee actually ended up creating its own organization, the School Improvement League, often associated with Eleuterio Escobar, who actually was a Lulac member. Also, he worked to pass resolutions and federal legislation by Lulac addressing the problem of minimum wage and child labor. Also, he was quite active with the Flying Squadron, which went on to create chapters in places like Austin and Osuna and many, many others. By 1937, Paralyze actually quit Lulac because Council 16 was ended because it was a dual council. There were 2 councils in San Antonio. Nevertheless, Lulac by 1940 had 100 chapters. We also know that Perales did not support the pecan sheller strike, but only because it was led by communists in Matenayuca. And again, I suggest people look at the work of Laura Cannon to get more information about that. Lulac went on to expand throughout the state, moving into New Mexico, moving into Arizona, Colorado, and by the 1950s, it spread to the Midwest, Illinois, and Iowa. By 1960, there were over 340 chapters, and by 1979, Lulac was in 33 states. One of the most important activities of Perales was to work to press for what was called the Federal Employment Practices Commission, FEPC, which was a precursor to the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunities. Again, only about 5% of Mexican heritage people worked in defense industries where there was oil, mining, or aircraft. But in Texas, New Mexico, and Louisiana, which was one district of the FEPC, 37% of the cases were by Latinos, including Kelly Air Force Base in San Antonio. And again, the goal was by this short-lived federal agency was to not permit discrimination based on race and which impacted position and wages. Perales was a major player with the FEPC, working in conjunction with Dennis Chavez, the sole Latino congressperson at the time. Perales was a lawyer. Between 1931 and 1967, there were only 85 Latinos in San Antonio out of 700. So again, most of those would have been during the latter 60s or so. Also, as a lawyer, Perales worked on the Salvatierra versus Del Rio case, which was the first lawsuit, a class action lawsuit against segregated schools in Texas. Also in 1948, he worked with Carlos Cadena on the Puente housing desegregation following a Supreme Court ruling that did not allow for racial covenants in housing in San Antonio. Also, very interestingly, in 1958, he argued, helped on a case for a woman named Rachel Gonzalez, who killed a lover, and she committed murder. Perales worked pro bono on that case, calling it a women's rights case because she felt and he felt that the man had done a disservice to her by impregnating her while he was pregnant. Also, amongst Perales' contributions, really he is a role model, protege, a true friend to Gus Garcia, Carlos Cadena, Henry B. Gonzalez, Albert Peña, and even the very young 16-year-old Vilma Martinez, who went on to work with the MALDEF organization and the Chicano Rights Project. So Perales took her into his office. She was the daughter of friends, and he mentored her, and she went on to do wonderful things as a Chicana lawyer. Also, he recorded and took up numerous affidavits documenting racial discrimination, especially in the 30s, in his book, In Defense of the Mi Raza. Some of those affidavits were used by the Mexican Consul during World War II to temporarily stop the entrance of Braceros into Texas because of racial discrimination, as well as extreme exploitation. Perales did so much pro bono work that we don't even know about, but most of his life was about empowering the community and helping those who were not able to pay. At the same time, Perales, we can talk about his role in empowering and disempowering Tejanos or Mexican and Latinas in Texas. Again, when Lulac was formed, women were not initially included in 1929 in its initial constitution and founding. Really, Paralyze and Canales should have taken note that women were allowed to vote since 1920. Our women were part of our community and could have helped to empower us further. Also, we saw gender segregated councils, women's councils, called ladies' councils, and men's councils. Very, very common until the 1970s when we had the Chicano movement. Still, we know that his wife, Marta Perales, led a somewhat semi-traditional role, but also unique because she was a college graduate. She was the daughter of an activist, Casimiro Perez Alvarez from Rio Grande City. She was a pianist, a singer, an inventor, and also a bookstore owner. So she did not get involved in Ladies Lulac, enjoyed the social life connected to Perales' work. But we also see that Perales was also different because he had as his friend co-activist Adela Slas-Bento, a major woman civil rights activist. As I mentioned, he mentored Vilma Martinez, and he took up the Rachel Gonzalez case, which he himself called a women's rights case. So again, Perales has a mixed record on the question of gender. Paralyze was also a public intellectual. He wrote in newspapers beginning in 1919 all the way to the late 50s. Again, he passed in 1960. He was a columnist for the La Prensa newspaper, which began around 1913 or so. Again, organized by the Lozano family. The Lozano family went on to create La Opinión in San Antonio. He was a friend of the father of Henry B. Gonzalez, connected with the La Prensa. He was also a columnist for the La Voz Católica as a Catholic and religious writer. In addition, he wrote several books. He wrote a book called In Defensa de Mi Raza with 2 volumes, which really does record the origins of Lulac and also provides all those affidavits about discrimination all across Texas towns, about 100 Texas towns. He also wrote a book called Are We Good Neighbors?, questioning whether or not there was such a thing called the good neighbor policy and to what extent white racism was vibrant in Texas. He was heard on the radio all the time. He was an important orator. We know that as an orator, he was a very effective speaker. Both in his stature, he was a tall man, and also he reportedly had a vibrant voice. In addition to all of this, before Alonso Perales truly even created the Lulac organization, he did something even more amazing. He served as a diplomat for the United States government. Again, he was fully bilingual. He worked as a translator and a lawyer in about 13 different places, diplomatic missions in Central America, in Nicaragua, in North America, in Mexico, in South America, Bolivia, Peru, in the Caribbean, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. It's also interesting that he was worked for the dictator Anastasio Somoza of Nicaragua. What's interesting about Paralyze is that he fights for democracy here at home in San Antonio, Texas, US, but seems to be relatively silent on the question of dictatorship in Latin America. And again, a future researcher can find out more about that. We also know that because of his connections with being actually serving as a consul, a consul for Nicaragua, that for a number of years, he actually is able to attend United Nations founding in San Francisco in 1945. And there he wrote a resolution and got a resolution passed calling on civil rights legislation in everyone's respective countries. So Perales had a very amazing life. And I would like now to share the photos that we have of Paralyze that will tell us a little bit more about him. Next, please. To start the project, I was actually sent a microfilm, which is an old technology, but I was sent microfilm to begin my research. I decided to visit the archive instead. Next. Here is what the Paralyze papers look like. There's actually 13 boxes like that, and you will see that every box has many, many folders, and inside every folder are many, many documents. There are about 11,000 documents in the Paralyze collection. Next. Here again, you get a view. So you have to have a lot of patience in order to do this kind of archival historical research. A very limited amount of the Paralyze papers are digitized. Next. And that's a picture of me. Again, you sit there for hours and hours. I would say I probably spent about a month, 8 to 5, in the Paralyze collection. Next. Next. Again, he started in Alice, Texas. The population there would have been several thousand. It was racially segregated for persons of Mexican descent, as well for African Americans. Paralyze also inherited the racist ideas about African Americans that would have been quite common for just about everybody in that time period. Next. Here's what rural Alice looked like. Again, he was an orphan. He should have probably been a depressed, wayward, alcoholic boy, but he went on to become one of the most important and powerful persons due to his upbringing in Alice. Next. Here's one of the first photos that we have of Alonso Perales as a young man, and you can already see that he's well-dressed here. Next. Here we have another picture of Paralyze. I have not encountered a photo of Paralyze without a suit. He very much looked the professional, which he was. Next. Moving into San Antonio, he went on to attend, as I mentioned, this school, which would have been common for teachers as well as people in commerce to attend some kind of business school. Here he improved his writing, his typing, commercial law, anything and everything related to white-collar work. Next. He worked for a saddlery company in San Antonio. These are the saddle makers who probably interacted with them, but he was mostly a translator and a stenography. This company went on to do international work with places like Cuba. Next. And then, as I mentioned, he was drafted into World War I. Unlike his friend and colleague, J. Lou Sines, he did not volunteer and he did not get sent to Europe. So he was fortunate, but his clerical and white-collar skills were improved during World War I. And likely he became more patriotic to the U.S. at this time as well. Next. Moving on into Washington. Next. Again, Paralyze really had about a junior high education in Alice, Texas, didn't really do much in San Antonio except work. And then he went on to complete high school in Washington, D.C. Next. And here's a close-up of him in 1921. Next. Here's a picture of his graduation. Again, imagine that the majority of the Mexican descent community has maybe a few grades of education, not even junior high, not even high school. And here's Paralyze. Next. Here we have a picture of he and Marta. He met Marta at a social occasion in San Antonio. He realized that she really was a perfect match for him. Intelligent, coming from a solid middle-class background. We might even call gente decente, people who had land grant way back from Rio Grande City. Next. Moving on. Next. Again, we have his picture on the passport. You can see he's a young man. Okay, and remember, he's getting a passport so he can do diplomatic work, and he's in his 20s. Next. Here's another picture of him in his early 20s. Next. Here's a newspaper article about one of the conflicts that he dealt with in Peru and Chile. That's him in the middle there in the front. Next. Yes, that's him. And here we have his calling card because he did become the consulate for Nicaragua while living here in San Antonio. Next. Here's a picture of Somoza. There is a little bit of correspondence. The Somozas actually several generations of dictatorship in Nicaragua. It's still problems in Nicaragua today. Next. And here we have a picture. You can see in the back, second to the left, we have Perales there. And again, Marta Perales on the second row, third to the right. She is there. There you go. There she is right there. Next, please. Next. As an attorney, again, Perales was very fortunate because when he returned to Texas, he wanted to come to Texas because he knew there was something called the so-called Mexican problem. His whole life was dedicated to getting rid of the so-called Mexican problem. The idea was that really how whites at that time saw the Mexican and Mexican descent community as a problem for the society and therefore instigated racial segregation, et cetera, et cetera. But here's his calling card. Next. Here's a wonderful picture of Perales with some of his law books. This photo, I believe, is actually from the 40s, but gives you a sense of his life. Next. Here we have a photo of J.T. Canales. Canales was also from a family in Brownsville that had a land grant and was able to keep the land grant. And not only did they have land, but they also, through the generations, had cattle, cotton, and then oil and gas. Canales was in the valley and offered Perales his first job. Canales was a friend of Perales' father-in-law, and that's how the connection was made. Canales was also the only Tejano legislator in the 1910s, and he is the person who filed charges against the racial violence by the Texas Rangers. Next. Here we have MC Gonzalez, probably about the third Tejano lawyer, also a major founder of Lulac and also one of the early national presidents of Lulac. Next. Here we have Gus Garcia. Gus Garcia also was assisted by Alonso Perales. I know Gus Garcia gets a lot of attention, perhaps because he died early as an alcoholic and an attorney and died on a park bench. But the more impressive lawyer actually is not Gus Garcia, but is Alonso Perales, if you look at the entire spectrum of their lives. Next. And here you have a picture of Carlos Cadena. Also, I believe it was Perales that negotiated with the mayor, I think it was Quinn, to get Carlos Cadena his first position with the city in the early 1940s. Next. And here we have a picture of the very famous 1954 Supreme Court victory we see Gus Garcia on the right, Carlos Cadena in the middle, and John J. Herrera, all Lulacers. Again, Lulac really was the political machine for the rise of all of these major lawyers and civil rights leaders. Next. Here we have a picture of that same event, and these are the major Tejano civil rights activists at the time. Again, you will note they are all men. The first Tejana lawyer arose in the 1950s, and then Adela Callejo, I believe her name was, in Dallas around 1969 or so. Next. Here we have the young Vilma Martinez. There was an article in La Prensa And Perales really does not only talk about her as uh, a social person because it's a quinceañera, but he talks about her being intelligent and bright, and suggests she is a model for young women. So again, we see Perales making some very positive statements about women. Next. Here we have Perales defending Rachel Gonzalez. Again, this was a pro bono case. He felt offended that the person that she killed supposedly had lied to her and perhaps had wooed her into bed, and therefore she had a child. Perhaps he was upset also that he himself knew what it was like to live without a true father. Next. He's an important orator. Next. Here is a picture of Perales taken from the De los Bento book. Again, you can see well dressed. You can see he's using his hands as a forceful speaker. Next. Here's a picture, the full photograph that you can see him. I'm not sure if this is at his office, but you can see very well dressed, very powerful. And again, this is the book that came out of the Paralysis conference, and it is available. Next. Here in 1952, we see again Paralysis as an orator lifting his arms. Again, this is in the Brownsville area, arguing for President Eisenhower, who was a Republican in 1952. Next. Next, as I mentioned, he's an important public intellectual. Here's one of the early booklets that he wrote in 1931, written in Spanish and paid for by a number of businesses in San Antonio, where he does talk about bossism, and he also talks about the importance of voting and the importance of paying the poll tax. I should also mention that even less than 10 years ago, in an article or a book by Jose Angel Gutierrez, who is a political scientist and also a founder of Raza Unida, went on to write something to the effect that Lulac did not even support or advocate for payment of the poll tax, which is the biggest untruth about Lulac in these early years, and especially about Paralysis. Next. Here we have a sketch, probably by Paralysis, for what the book was supposed to look like, but they ended up with a different cover. Next. And here is one of the editions, the cover in defense of my raza, again, which was included all kinds of articles about Paralysis activity from 1919 all the way till 1936. Next. Here we have another version, and you can see this one has probably published later because that photo looks like it's from the 1950s. Next. And then, of course, this is his book that questioned the good neighbor policy of the United States and questioned the so-called Good Neighbor Commission in Texas, which did very little to stop racism in Texas. Next. Moving on to politics. Next. As I mentioned, Paralysis worked to get the Federal Employment Practices Commission to not just pay attention to employment discrimination against African Americans, but also against Latinos. And it was quite effective for its short-lived years, 3 or 4 years, throughout places like Texas. Next. As I mentioned, 1946, Paralysis did run for office only one time. He could have easily run for office again. He could have easily, over time, become a city councilman, a county commissioner, a state legislator, even a congressman like Henry V. Gonzalez, who he really empowered, but he felt he did a better job in the background. And from this point on, 1946, the San Antonio Mexican community began to feel like if they paid their poll tax and mobilized, they could actually win. Next. Next. Again, Perales also took advantage of what we call Pan-Americanism, which arose in the 30s and 40s. The idea by the U.S. federal government was to tell Latin American countries, we are your friend, we want to work with you, we don't want to do as much intervention as we had in the past. Perales took advantage of those themes in order to promote non-discrimination and anti-racism. And here he is with the Pan American Roundtable, which he also had conflict with because they also did not do very much. Next. Here's a picture of Perales' wife, Marta, on the right, participating in Pan American activities. Next. Moving on to talk about him as a civil rights activist. Next. Again, common to see what we are now calling Juan Crow, not Jim Crow, affecting the Black community, but racism, segregation, specifically aimed at us as well. Next. Here's a picture of the Order Sons of America. We don't have, at this point, we don't have any photos of the Order Sons in San Antonio. Probably newspaper work would uncover that. Next. And here we have again the Order Sons in Corpus Christi. Again, you can see they are well dressed here. This is a Sunday outing. Next. Here's a paper from the Adela Sloss Bento collection, and she kept documents related to the Harlingen Convention, which she was not allowed to attend because she was a woman. Next. Here's actually the convention program where they talk about what kind of organization should we form and how do we get everybody together. It was decided at this conference that Mexican citizens should not be allowed, so they could use the theme of U.S. citizenship to argue for our rights, civil rights. Next. Here's a picture of the Constitutional Convention in Corpus. Paralyze is actually out of the country as a U.S. diplomat. He is present at the February founding conference. This one was taken in May, probably by Professor Oliver Douglas Weeks, a political scientist who wrote about the emerging Lulac. Next. Moving on to the 30s. Next. Here's a picture of the first convention after the founding, the year after. This is in Alice, Texas, and Paralyze is in this photo. Next. Women are also present, you can see. Moving on. Next. Here's some pictures of Paralyze as he's getting a little bit older. Next. Here is a calavera that's lauding Paralyze. Mostly the calaveras were quite positive in their portrayal of Paralyze. Next. Here's another one. Next. Next. He appeared on several newspapers or magazines. This is one out of Mission, Texas, where he is being honored, 1952. Next. Here is when he receives an award from Spain. On the left is Dr. Carlos Castañeda, a historian at the University of Texas, also one of the most educated and major civil rights activists as well. He is not just a historian sitting in a library. He is an activist. They were best friends. The two of them were best friends. Next. Here again, we have the nice photo portrait of Paralyze with his award from Spain. Next. Here also in the 1950s, there were enough Mexican, American, Latino, middle-class people, men, lawyers, doctors, etc., that they had an optimist group, which really just helped the Latino poor, mostly poor boys. Next. Next. Here again is Marta Perales in Washington, D.C. She kept active. She socialized with others while she was in Washington, D.C. with him. Next. Here's a wonderful picture of them in downtown San Antonio. Next. Here's a picture of her as an opera singer. Next. As a pianist, again, she learned these social graces as a young woman in Rio Grande City. Next. But she's also an inventor. She invented 2 or 3 things, including a rotating cabinet file. So she is not the stereotypical little woman in the home. Next. And here's a picture of her. She did travel often with Perales. Here they are in San Francisco at the United Nations. Next. And in the 1950s, they decided to adopt 3 children. They had not had children up to this point, and so they adopted 3 children. Here's a picture of Perales, Alonso Jr., and Marta. Missing here is Raimundo, the third child that was adopted. Next. Perales had both friends and what we can call frenemies as well. Next. Here's Fortino Trevino. He's the young man that Perales grew up in the Trevino family there in Alice, Texas. He also went on to World War I, and he became a Lulacer. Next. Again, J.T. Canales was one of his best friends. Next. J. Lou Saenz, also, again, a World War I veteran and a teacher. Also a major founder of the LAC organization and Lulac. Next. Here we have a picture of Adela Sloss Vento when she's about 26. She graduated from high school. Again, you can see my book, Agent of Change, to see all the things that she did as a civil rights activist and a writer. Next. Here's a cover of the book that she wrote. Again, very few people knew about the book. It's an important book about Perales. Next. Here's Dr. Carlos Castañeda, again, his major best friend. They wrote extensively, so we have copies of letters from both of them to one another. Next. And here I called MC Gonzalez, one of his frenemies. They had a little bit of conflict across the years. Nonetheless, they continued to work together. They put aside personal differences to advance the cause. Next. Another frenemy was Dr. George Sanchez. Sanchez actually was a graduate student, and that's when he found out about Lulac. In the early 40s, he went on to become a national Lulac president. He was a major advocate in education, a major civil rights activist. Next. And with that, I'd like to conclude. Next. I want to say also that Perales had a column called Arquitectos de Nuestro Destino. I consider Perales to be a major architect of our Latina destiny, really building a foundation that most of us have no idea that what he did, what he built. Here's a wonderful photograph by Russell Lee, a very prominent photographer in 1949. I love this photo because Perales is smiling. He had a lot of challenges, but he also recognized his achievements over time. Next. Again, here's a copy of what the book looks like. I'm very happy with the wonderful work that Arte Publico Press has done to get this book out. While it's a lengthy book, it's over 500 pages. I want folks to read it little by little. They can pick and choose to read all the interesting chapters, whether it's about family, religion, politics, or whatever. Next. Here's some the various collections that have a few photographs. Most of them, however, do come from the Paralyze collection at the University of Houston. Next. And finally, should anyone want to contact me, here is that information. And I very much welcome personal visits. They're more exciting. We can get into more detail. But I am available for Zoom as well. So thank you very much for having me. And we can open up to questions if folks have questions.
Cynthia, I know earlier you and I were discussing that this book is pretty big, but there has not been a comprehensive biography of him up until now. And so it has to be this big because
Yes.
there's so much that we, the public, don't know about him.
Correct.
And I will say, I started reading it. I haven't finished, but it is so good. Things that I mean, I'm relatively
Yes.
up to date on this, but there are things in here that I did not know. And what an impressive and complicated person. We did get we're getting a lot of people saying excellent presentation, but we do have a few questions. I wanted to start with a question from Teresa Gutierrez. She says, this is all awesome. You mentioned he did not get sent to Europe. Where did he serve and what years of the war? And I was actually wondering if we could maybe expand that just a little bit to talk about Mexican Americans in World War I and what did they do in World War I?
Okay.
I think a lot of times people think that we weren't in the war until maybe
Okay. Yes, World War I started in 1914, but the U.S. was neutral till 1917. So the war lasted till 1919. So our participation, Latino participation, was an important part of that. Both non-citizens and U.S. citizens, they took non-citizens. Okay, so we did participate in the war. And I should recommend the book written by J. Lou Sines. He wrote a diary about Mexican Americans and Latinos in World War I. So folks should look for that. And of course, I have a chapter about World War I in my book. And he did serve in San Antonio. He did not leave San Antonio. So that's where Perales was during the war.
Yeah, and so I think you mentioned he was putting his business school skills to use. That he
yes,
was more of a
clerical, yes, and he got excellent letters of recommendations, not only from military personnel but also from those people, European Americans, Anglos that he worked for in San Antonio. So that was quite excellent that they thought so highly of him, even if he was of Mexican descent.
Yes, absolutely. We have another question from Dr. Gabriela Gonzalez. She wants to know, did Paralyze share any communication with Dr. Martin Luther King or any other member of the African American civil rights movement?
Yes. During the early 1940s, he does correspond with A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph is a major mover and shaker to create FEPC. So we kind of, Perales and what's his name? Dennis Chavez, our senator from New Mexico, they're really making those connections and doing some coalition work. But again, the contact was limited and was not sustained over time. Basically, it is true that mostly we have two separate civil rights movements for the most part.
There's also a question about the reaction to or reception to Paralyze during the Chicano movement. Could you maybe say a little bit more about that?
Yes. In the early, I would say in the 1960s and 70s, there was the kind of a redefining of our identity by youth, folks who began calling themselves Chicano. They rejected the use of Mexican American. They believed a little bit more pride in their Mexican heritage. They believed that Lulac and Paralyze were simulationists. They believed that they were middle class who ignored the working class and didn't address working class needs. But really, this generation would have learned about what Paralyze and Lulac did. We barely had any historians to give them that information. And so there was kind of a generational gap. And so therefore, they felt like what they were doing was better and more correct, et cetera, et cetera. But again, we do have to remember that the times that Paralyze and Lulac worked in were much more racially charged. There was a lot more racial violence, lynching, the Texas Rangers, and it was difficult to be of Mexican descent in this time period. So The literature has changed a little bit over the time, over the decades, but I'm still shocked to see anti-Perales and more so anti-Lulac comments based mostly on ignorance, that people are not aware of everything that Lulac has done, especially in a place like San Antonio. I sometimes think of the movie It's a Wonderful Life, which many people see at Christmas, and think about what would Texas and what would the United States have been without the LULAC organization. And I think of how backward, I mean, it's still backwards in many ways, but I think about how worse off our community would have been had it not been for Perales and the LULAC organization.
We got a comment from Susie who says this is excellent information. She wants to know where to purchase the book. I dropped the link in the chat for you, Susie. She also says she thinks her grandfather, Felipe Valencia, may have worked with Paralyze. So
Yes.
how
Yes.
wonderful.
Yes, Felipe Valencia is actually the first editor of Lulac News. Lulac News was the major vehicle that Lulac used to communicate and spread Lulac ideology from 1931, and it continues to today. It's changed quite a bit in form, but really it was a monthly. And I want folks to remember that Lulac was founded in 1929, and the Depression started right afterwards. So the fact that Lulac was able to survive and even thrive eventually, despite the Depression, is a miracle. And racial segregation was one of their major targets. And of course, working on the poll tax. There's a million issues that Lulac in different communities worked on. And I hope people will see some of the detail, especially when I talk about Perales, especially in the 30s, all the kind of work that Lulac was doing in the 1930s.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from David Contreras from Houston. What was Paralysis' position regarding the Bracero program? And he would like to know, can you compare that to maybe what the American GI Forum, what their position was?
Okay, well, I think they were primarily similar. The Bracero program lasted from around 1942 to 1964. And it was an agreement between more powerful United States and Mexico about the United States using and actually permitted to abuse Mexican workers here, so-called temporarily. Now, that was supposed to be a war measure, but because the exploitation was so effective, it continued on to 64. We know mostly that Perales and Lulacers and the GI Forum were concerned that the super exploitation of braceros also meant that it had an impact on the Tejano workers who were already underpaid, but the braceros allowed for so-called cheaper labor. So we could say that Lulac and the American GI Forum were concerned not only with the exploitation of the braceros, because there was super exploitation, but also the impact on the Tejano workers. So they did work to try to stop the Bracero program because of those two features.
Mm-hmm. We have a comment from Magda Sanchez. She wants to know if this presentation can be made available. This presentation is going to stay on MACRI's Facebook page and YouTube channels. I encourage you to watch it again, share it with your friends, share it with your family. You're absolutely right, Magda. This is educational, and everybody needs to know this history.
Yes, and folks can access, I wrote a very short little article about Paralyze for the Handbook of Texas, which is online. And that's kind of a short history of Paralyze. But really, there, as you have suggested, so much of our history is not available. For example, Perales and Canales, I believe, are not on the TEKS, TEKS, which is the official topics that are included in our curriculum, our public school curriculum. We're hoping that down the line they should be included. Again, very, very significant people, and we need our history in the schools, the public schools especially.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a question from, I believe this is um, Jesse from Texas Southern University. He wants to know, I'm sorry, well, what were the years of operation or existence of the FEPC that Paralyze was involved in?
Yes, the FEPC, I think it's either 41 or 42 to about to the when the war ended. Again, because Southern congressmen, re- Republicans, and conservatives who were racist did not want the FEPC because it actually outlawed discrimination against people of color, particularly Latinos and African Americans, because of the war. And again, it was in our interest to continue FEPC, but conservative forces said no. We want to use employment discrimination to keep people of color in their place.
Okay, one last question. A lot of people thanking you for your work, but one last question. What can we do to continue to honor Paralysis' legacy today?
Well, number one, folks need to read the book. Okay, so that's the one thing. I would hope that folks would advocate to get the book in the libraries. I hope that down the line with MACRI, we can create an exhibit. I know you have suggested that. I'm hoping that we can get some filmmaker can get up and say, hey, we need a film about Perales. We are also approaching the 100th anniversary of Lulac in 2029. We need a good film about the history of Lulac. And again, I'm at this point, I'm the expert on Paralysis, and I want to thank Arte Público Press for giving me the opportunity to write the book. I also want to thank Marta Perales, the daughter, for getting the collection into the library at U of H. Again, the papers were in the family home from 1960 to 2019. And again, we have cases where important collections are in people's homes and the librarians, archivists do not know about them or not seeking them out. We need more attention to Latina archives. Get them into the libraries, and nerdy people such as myself will use them.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Cynthia. It's always such an honor to be among your scholarship. Your excellent scholarship speaks so deeply to the undertold stories the public needs to know. So thank you, Dr. Orozco, and thank you to everybody in the audience who tuned in tonight. I also want to thank AARP for sponsoring tonight's talk. As I previously mentioned, if you weren't able to catch all of tonight's talk or you want to share it with others, this talk will remain on MACRI's Facebook page and YouTube pages. So you can watch them later on, you can share them with other people, and in fact, I hope you will. Also, I want to invite you to join us in a couple of weeks. We will have on March 16th, Dr. Jesse Esparza from Texas Southern University joining us for a MACRI talk called I Can Hate No More, Preserving the History and Memory of Joe Campos Torres. That will be in 2 weeks, March 16th at 6 p.m. Central. So I hope you can join us for that. If you like tonight's presentation, I encourage you to learn more about what we're doing at the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute and how you can support our vision for a national center dedicated to preserving and sharing Mexican American civil rights history for all Americans by visiting our website at www.somosmacri.org. Thank you again, Dr. Orozco. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you to MACRI.
Good night, everyone.